Hello, everyone, and many thanks for joining us today for US Studies Online's May Book Hour with Dr. Mary Burke and her new book, Race, Politics and Irish America, A Gothic History, published in 2023 by Oxford University Press. I would like to start by introducing Dr. Mary Burke from the University of Connecticut, where she is a professor of English. Dr. Burke is the author of Race, Politics and Irish America, A Gothic History, and her first book, Thinkers, Singe and the Cultural History of the Irish Traveller, was also published with Oxford University Press. It was a cultural history of the Irish travellers, and she has since collaborated with Tramp Press on the 2022 reissue edition of Juanita Casey's The Horse of Selene. Dr. Burke is a former NEH Irish Institute Fellow at the University of Notre Dame. She is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast. Today, Mary will talk about her research and the new book, and then we have time for questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box or raise your hand if you'd like to pose a question to Mary yourself. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Aya. And thank you to the USSO Book Hour. It's an honor to be here, and it's nice to meet you, so to speak, at last. So my book, Race, Politics and Irish America, it comes out of my experience of living and studying on both sides of the Irish border and then immigrating to an America with an enormous diversity of Irishnesses, that's a plural. That same experience will also inform my comparison at the close today of Irish UK versus US academia. So the book examines the cultural legacies of the forcibly transported Irish, the Scots-Irish and post-famine Catholic immigrants. It does so through the words and lives of Black and white writers and public figures of Irish connection in the Americas. The Irish brought the sectarianism, settler colonial violence they had experienced and inflicted from the disordered colonial motherland. Consequently, they became both colluders in and victims of oppression in America. As a further consequence, Irish history seemed to repeat on American soil. And I'll explain presently how that makes the history Gothic. So some of the writers that I consider, I have them up here on screen, I hope, right? So American scholars often ignore Irish history in relation to writers of Irish connection, even if such writers themselves do not. Texts by or about the descendants of the Irish often conjure up the traumatic history of both Ireland and the Americas, implying their connectedness. For instance, the Irish-American dramatist Eugene O'Neill, he simultaneously evokes the seizure of both Gaelic and Indigenous American lands in a work that ostensibly portrays only America. So this recent Dublin production of a play set on a seized 19th century New England farm drew attention to the play's usually obscured echoes of 17th century Ireland by using Ulster accents. So in short, if the past is a foreign country, then for American writers, that country was often Ireland. Also considered are public figures of Irish connection known on both sides of the Atlantic. The sometimes surprising connection between these Black and white figures in terms of culture, race, and Irishness. These connections form the basis of many of the discussions in my book. I'll give a survey of the book and then turn to its final chapters, which are on Grace Kelly, later Princess Grace of Monaco, and the Kennedy dynasty. At that point, I'll get back to the notion of the Gothic. So, quick survey. So the Irish pursuit of whiteness that was perceived to be the social and cultural possession of what became known as Anglo-Saxon America. This pursuit is both critiqued and condoned by canonical writers of Irish descent or connection. I track Irish relations with peoples of colour, as well as how the Irish themselves racially transformed multiple times. I consider mixed race Irish Americans and these relations with people of color that could be both good and bad. And one of the good is this following one. This is, you have a quick look at the middle portrait there of O'Connell. So this is a racist lampoon, but it inadvertently memorializes Irish politician Daniel O'Connell's abolitionism. O'Connell was a progressive Irish nationalist who brought Frederick Douglass to Dublin in a failed attempt to encourage Irish nationalism to engage with global progressive causes. So the image suggests how the history of race and Irishness often hides in plain sight. Central to that history is the racial category of whiteness. The Irish gained it not once, as is often said, but multiple times. So I'm going to begin very briefly to describe the three racialized designations the Irish acquired in the Americas: Redlegs, Scots-Irish, and Black Irish. And the last is as applied to white Irish. So, Redlegs. So the southern United States was only the northernmost outpost of a plantation system that encompassed Caribbean. Thousands were forcibly shipped out of Ireland to the Caribbean after Cromwell's 1649 conquest of Ireland. Irish paleness, and thus the Irish tendency to sunburn, was racialized in the Caribbean with the designation redleg. In late 17th century Barbados, Irish redlegs and enslaved Africans conspired together to resist or kill their masters. As a result, strict differentiation between white transportee and enslaved black was enforced. Consequently, then, for the very first time in the Americas, the Irish became white. So Eugene O'Neill, again, he was particularly interested in evoking that history, and he throws Black Caribbeans and white Irish sailors together in his sea plays, his very early plays. Likewise, Faulkner's poor white turned planter character, Sutpen, in Absalom. Sutpen is of multiple abject British and Irish ancestries, but I read one of those ancestries as redleg. I draw on this 17th century stigmatizing of the to illuminate F. Scott Fitzgerald's seemingly counterintuitive use of tan to signal elite whiteness. And Fitzgerald himself was terrifically uneasy about his own Irishness, and I will get to that presently. So the second racialized designation the Irish acquired in the Americas is Scots-Irish. So the Ulster Scots, as they were Ireland, they were lowland Scottish Presbyterians who took over confiscated Gaelic land in 17th century Ulster. They subsequently departed for colonial America in large numbers. By 1790, one half of the 400,000 US residents who were commonly labeled Irish were of Ulster descent. As Patrick Griffith writes, their initial use in Ireland as bulwark between English and native Gael was repeated in America in a kind of Gothic return. And this is what they did in America, occupying unauthorized tracts unpurchased from Native Americans. The Ulster Irish on the frontier were ambiguously between European and native, legitimacy and illegitimacy, white and non-white, according to Griffith. Benjamin Franklin called the Scots-Irish perpetrators of an indiscriminate massacre of Native Americans in 1763. He called them Christian white savages, which implies, of course, a flawed whiteness. An insecure population in both realms, they did the dirty work of a more entrenched, more powerful colonial class. And I read this dual usage in their hidden in plain view presence in America's first Gothic novel, which is on your screen now, which is Edgar Huntley. It's concerned with violence on the frontier of the Anglo colony in both Ireland and Pennsylvania. However, for the Ulster Irish, the more white Anglo-Saxon coinage of Scots-Irish gained strong currency after the influx of poor Catholic Irish with the 1845 famine. In short, the Presbyterian Irish whitened at about the point the Catholic Irish arrived in the 1840s. So the third racialized designation that white Irish acquired in the Americas is Black Irish. So the post-famine Catholic Irish were initially racialized and then eventually whitened on America's eastern seaboard. This third full assimilation will be central to the stories of Princess Grace and John F. Kennedy, who were both of that origin and were both central to that sort of social transformation, racial transformation. So Black Irish, this term is applied to marginalized white famine Irish, suggests, of course, an existing white Irishness, which I think is Protestant Irish America by this point. And to give you a sense of how long this term persists, in 1933, F. Scott Fitzgerald described himself as half Black Irish in reference to his modest Irish roots. And this letter in which he wrote this was in response to John O'Hara's introduction of himself as, quote, the son of a Black Irish doctor. As used by these two Catholic Irish American writers, the phrase Black Irish signaled ambiguous white Irish placement within America's hierarchy of race, ethnicity, and class. And a further note, of course, on the term Black Irish is that American people of colour could identify as Irish too. Frank Yerby, the author here of the novel on screen. He was a Black and Irish American writer whose 1946 bestseller, The Foxes of Harrow, I consider, that's it in the Dutch translation. This novel about a morally conflicted Irish-born planter writes back to the Irish American Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind from Yerby's Black and Irish perspective. The term Black Irish was not available to Yerby, however, even though he effectively claims that identity, particularly in later interviews. More recently still, the term Black Irish has been effectively hijacked by white Irish Americans to describe a common Irish colouring. It's simply, you know, the usual sort of pale skin with dark hair. Such hijacking, such, you know, sort of defanging, I suppose, of the term means that Barack Obama has never been called what he might have been, which is America's first Black Irish president. Obama is only the most recent in a long line of presidents of white Protestant Irish roots. Andrew Jackson, of Ulster's settler colonial parentage, was the first of many Scots-Irish presidents. As with Kennedy later, and I pull Kennedy and Jackson together repeatedly in my book. So as with Kennedy later, Jackson's ascent to the highest office in the land signaled the arrival of his Irish cohort from the off-white wilderness of their earliest days in the Americas. So I'm going to return to my title, I suppose my subtitle really. So race in relation to Irish American politics makes some sense, I hope by now, but what has Gothic history to do with it? So Gothic is, of course, fiction or film with a sinister atmosphere in which the traumatic past or the dead return. In Gothic, past sins and the compromises required by obtaining and maintaining power often come home to roost. Andrew Jackson was the son of settler colonists. He was a major slaveholder, and of course, he was the scourge of Native Americans. Jackson's treatment of Americans of colour is a history that uncomfortably echoes the role some ancestors of the Scots-Irish played in the 17th century Ulster in taking over confiscated Gaelic land. Gothic is a genre that embraces portents of violence to come or warns of retribution for past sins. And I think in the case of this Jackson statue, we can say that graffiti can be Gothic too. Jackson is an ominous spectral presence in works by the Scots-Irish Henry James and the Irish F. Scott Fitzgerald. Edgar Allan Poe and Henry James, they're both of Scots-Irish ancestry. They use Gothic tropes to ruminate on how past violence unthinkingly repeats from father to son. Both Poe and James have doppelganger tales in which a man is terrorized by a dead male kinsman or ancestor of the exact same name. And of course, in the doppelganger mode, he's similar, but also unsettlingly different. So the Irish male body, I argue, is an ancestor-haunted text. The allegiances and the sins of the forefathers are inherited with the father's name, particularly so for the Irish, for whom names are often taken as evidence of loyalties, of denomination, or of ethnic origin. Altogether, I think Gothic better suits the expression of Irish anxieties than social realism, even though we're often encouraged to find some truth of Irish American experience in social realist fiction or in memoir. So I keep looking out at Jackson as Gothic villain, and that is not to say that Catholics fleeing sectarian Ireland thereby possessed some innate sympathy for oppressed peoples of colour. So a survey of the work and the antecedents of Margaret Mitchell suggests as much. She is, of course, the author of Gone with the Wind. So in Mitchell's 1936 novel, the Catholic Irish nationalist Gerald O'Hara, he flees sectarian Ireland. Subsequently, however, Gerald O'Hara is happy to seize lands for his slave plantation in the Georgia region that had been brutally cleared of Indigenous presence. This is almost certainly Margaret Mitchell at her family's plantation. So Margaret Mitchell's own Tipperary Catholic gentry antecedents had in fact acquired the Georgia land for this slave plantation in the same manner and location as her fiction. Their land had been cleared by no less a figure than General Andrew Jackson. So Jackson then returns as a spectral presence in Mitchell's novel and in Mitchell's family history as well. So I'll sort of pivot to, I suppose, what are the final chapters of the book. So what is the opposite of Gothic, if you were asked? Perhaps, pleasant fairy tales involving good and happy princesses. So I'm going to turn to the apparent fairy tale of the ascension of a woman of Famine Irish roots to royalty before a global audience. A Cinderella of the television age, she paves the way for the rise of a family of similar roots who, and this is not coincidence, became known as America's royals, and that is, of course, the Kennedys. Grace Kelly's 1956 royal wedding and John F. Kennedy's 1960 election were fairy tales, seeming fairy tales, of post-famine Irish full assimilation. Fulfilled, of course, long promise and now fulfilled. But this dream, this seeming dream, becomes Gothic nightmare after the deaths of both John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. But first, why Grace Kelly? So my book tries to expand upon the kinds of Irish Americans generally covered in surveys of that ethnic group. So I tend to emphasize women performers, public women, and queer, non-Catholic, and multiracial authors and figures of Irish connection. One of these very prominent public women is Grace Kelly. In 1956, when movie star Grace Kelly received the title of Princess Grace of Monaco, there was yet to be an American president who shared her Catholic famine Irish background. Kelly has not been seriously assessed in terms of her significance to Irish American whiteness. In America, Catholicism was stigmatized as the religion of not quite white immigrants. Thus, Kelly's explicitly Catholic wedding ceremony, which was broadcast globally, as I said, was impactful. It was one of the largest international media events of the 1950s. It was broadcast live on television by MGM, and it was watched by about 30 million people. So the bride's globally visible ascent to the highest echelon altered the social and racial status of Irish America. So the aspirational Irish Catholic Philadelphia of Grace's birth in 1928 was a place in which full acceptance into the elite, conservative, impeccably white and heterosexual WASP sphere was presented to the self-improving immigrant as a prize for which to aim. Grace's father founded a firm called Kelly for Brickwork, and the building boom of the 1920s made him a millionaire. So despite her patrician image, Grace Kelly was the endpoint of a multi-generation story that follows the broad contours of post-1845 famine Irish experience. Grace's paternal grandfather had been born in Mayo, Ireland, the famine year of 1847, and he immigrated to Pennsylvania 20 years later. I took this photo myself of his ancestral home. By contrast with that home, Kelly was raised in Philadelphia in this spacious mansion. The Kelly home was a very fine one, but in the eyes of old money Philadelphia, its gentility was punctured by the fact that it had been newly built in the late 1920s with bricks from the family's own firm. In short, for those of recent immigrant background, wealth and success were not enough for full acceptance in a place like WASP Philadelphia. So Grace Kelly was, of course, one of the most beautiful actresses of her century, but the idea of female Irish beauty was a disputed category in an earlier period. In this 19th century comic valentine, and comic valentines used to be a genre, the female Irish beauty has the exaggerated philtrum, the space between nose and upper lip. She has the exaggerated philtrum of the racist ape-like Irishman stereotype of the same period. So the packaging of Grace Kelly by the studio system was meant to diminish the usual associations of an Irish Catholic background in mainstream mid-century America. Grace's voice was trained at a private New York Academy of Dramatic Arts in the late 1940s to sound correct, that is, upper-class, transatlantic, Anglo-American. Grace's silence around reporters, she would never speak, was the very antithesis of the very, very old stereotype of Irish verbosity that we can say goes back to Shakespeare. This reinforced her slightly icy but elegant persona. Strikingly, before she became a major movie star, the early stage and television roles in which Kelly was cast as a privileged and beautiful wasp, these were all the fantasies of fellow Irish Americans, from her own playwright uncle, George Kelly, to Fitzgerald and James. That Irish American fantasy of elite status was made real in 1956 with Kelly's royal wedding. So the white wedding dress ostensibly signals sexual purity. However, in the racialized American context, it's always also been argued to signal privileged whiteness, since such a garment required, quote, a laundress, seamstress, and lady's maid to remain pristine. It's no accident, then, that Scarlett O'Hara wears a frou-frou white gown in the opening antebellum scene of Gone with the Wind. Richard Dyer, the great theorist of lighting and photography, he claims that in visual culture, idealized white women, quote, are bathed in and permeated by light. He further suggests that bridal wear particularly endows this glow, quote, weddings are the privileged moment of racial reproduction. The ubiquity of white as the color for wedding dresses, the veil, and the use of lace all facilitate a radiant look. Dark-skinned brides may wear white as well, of course, but their skin color is likely to contrast strongly with their bridal wear, whereas white women's complexions, especially in wedding photography, can seem like the apotheosis of the clothing's whiteness and glow. And he's, of course, talking about traditional photography, which was not set up to reproduce darker skin tones properly. He was writing in, I think, the 90s. So for Dyer, Queen Victoria wore white at her wedding, not to signal purity, but to signal privilege. The image of the radiant Grace Kelly on her wedding day has been endlessly disseminated. In her case, it was not so much a moment of what Dyer calls here a racial reproduction as one in which her ethnic cohort's racial whiteness was finally unequivocally confirmed. Altogether, Grace's so-called fairy tale 1956 spectacular was very much a white wedding in multiple registers. It paves the way for the Irish to finally ascend to American royalty, that is the Kennedys. So the election of the first Catholic Irish president only 4 years after Grace's wedding, I think further cements this Irish American dream of full assimilation. However, foundational Gothic holds that where there's a fair princess in a castle and where there's power, there's soon nightmare. After the Kennedy assassinations, cultural and journalistic portrayals of the family use Gothic vocabulary, a genre that centers on power and its abuse. Gothic fit competing conspiracy theories that depicted the Kennedys as both innocent victims and wicked schemers. So let's just go back to foundational Gothic. So from its 18th century English beginnings, Gothic used a sinister atmosphere of conspiracy and or the supernatural and featured a powerful corrupt Catholic patriarch or aristocrat. So many other elements, these foundational elements, they repeat over centuries. So a secret or a curse linked to a corrupt bloodline. And as I read all these, bear in mind what we hear and read of the Kennedys. So a secret or curse linked to a corrupt bloodline, sexual excess, endangered beautiful women, disrupted inheritance, or murdered heirs. For both sides of America's political divide, the Kennedys seemed to fit the ready-made mold of Gothic, though in different ways. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, liberals and Democrats who had approved of his administration's progressive politics believed that the idealistic Kennedys were the innocent victims of a dark conspiracy or conspiracies. However, for conservatives and for Catholic Irish Americans who were increasingly leaving traditional Democratic Party loyalty behind, the family known as America's royals represented the immorality of the aristocratic elite. In traditional 18th century British Gothic, the usual source of such corruption is, of course, the powerful Catholic elder. In Kennedy Gothic narrative, that role was assigned to the president's father, Joe Kennedy Sr. The patriarch, the very Gothic ambitions to hereditary rule, as it was perceived, were repeatedly disrupted. Joe Sr. strategized JFK's rise only after the firstborn he had planned to make president, Joe Jr., only after he died during World War II. Kennedy Gothic enfolds even those who received that name through marriage. Jacqueline Kennedy was filmed crawling in the presidential convertible in a bloodied suit immediately after her husband was shot. In that moment, she became Gothic's endangered, beautiful woman. Now, very strikingly, Mrs. Kennedy's eerie official portrait, which you see on screen here, it resembles very, very much the fleeing woman in floaty white gown of 1960s and 1970s Gothic paperback tradition. In a Life magazine interview right after the assassination, days after the assassination, Jackie discussed being presented with blood red roses on arrival in Dallas. She discusses it as a bad omen. Quote, she remembers thinking, how funny, red roses for me. And then the car was full of blood and red roses. In the same interview, Jacqueline used the phrase Camelot to refer to the idealism of her husband's administration. Bobby Kennedy had served as the US Attorney General in his brother's administration and is remembered for giving strong support to civil rights in that role to this day. However, many biographers in the years that followed painted the picture of a morally complex Kennedy family. Male Kennedy's liberal behavior with women got as much press as their liberal politics. This particularly, I think, focused on the 1969 death of a young woman in the company of Ted Kennedy, the president's brother. So a year after Robert's assassination, Ted drove off a bridge in Massachusetts. His passenger, Mary Burke, drowned, and Ted Kennedy did not report the accident for hours. In a televised public response, Ted referred to the role played by what he called some awful curse in the woman's death. Ted's voicing of the very Gothic idea of a family curse took off as popular lore, and ongoing Kennedy tragedies have been described in this way ever since. So I'm going to conclude this portion of my talk by noting that the reading of the family's history as curse taps into the long Irish American cultural tradition of the past as Gothic, as one in which unresolved sins or unresolved trauma demand later retribution or acknowledgement. Thank you all for bearing with me.
That was brilliant. I love the imagery. It's always nice to have that kind of visual reminders of all these things, and having that official portrait of Jacqueline Kennedy as I can imagine so many different Gothic book covers.
Yes, I didn't, for copyright reasons, I couldn't show Gothic book covers, but there are wonderful collections out there. There are people who are obsessed by them and collect them. So there are websites out there where you can place these images side by side and see for yourself.
Just thinking about the Du Maurier books, for example, that is one of the first ones that comes to mind, something like Rebecca in the old editions and so on, standing in front of a big window in one of the big rooms, and all of that comes to mind.
It's always the backdrop of the house that is the real erotic object in the novel.
Exactly.
And the sort of the endangered, beautiful young bride or bride. Yes, it's
always
amazing. Yeah.
And all the ominous background, like you mentioned just now, all the kind of curses and lores and things like that, ominous powers that be. It's not me, it's the ominous powers behind me.
Yeah.
That was brilliant.
Thank you.
I don't know if you wanted to chat a little bit now or then later on about your research in general, not in the book itself, but what led you to it, and being in the US, in Connecticut now, having been educated and born in Ireland, about your experiences in that kind of how much. Well, I have a couple of questions. I'm gathering my thoughts here. How much did your own Irish identity play into this topic of research, and was that a consideration for you when you started it, as well as where you're placed now in the US versus where you came from? And that would be my first question. Okay,
so I guess as I said at the start, the book, but also what I'm the useful information I'm hoping to sort of give in terms of that contrast between both sides of the Atlantic. They both came out of my experience of living and studying on both sides of the border, as well as on both sides of the Atlantic. So this book took a while to percolate, because of course, I did lots of research and it's scholarly, but I'm also drawing on, I think, my lived experience to a certain extent as well. As you know, your sense of yourself becomes unmoored when you move country, move language. Well, I didn't move language, you did, but I moved dialect, I suppose. So I guess I've made some notes regarding, what I hope will be useful information. Would you like me to sort of just go to those a little bit, and then we can see if anyone needs clarification?
Oh, absolutely. I think
Okay.
a lot of our listeners or people who follow us and contribute with us are either postgraduate or early career researchers. So and because it's an American Studies platform associated with the British Association for American Studies, so all of that is very important for us to understand. Because American Studies is not just America and US and England, which tends to be what a lot of people think about as well. So it's interesting to see what the other career options are, academic options are, how to kind of navigate those differences in getting placements, getting jobs, getting published, and sort of things.
Yeah. So I guess this is my experience of transitioning from one side to the other. So I studied first at undergraduate level at Trinity College Dublin in the Republic of Ireland, of course, and then I went on to postgraduate study at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland in the early 2000s. Obviously, these are two distinct education systems, but my experience is that the Irish and the UK systems are more similar to each other, than not. So I'm going to compare the UK and Irish side to my experience of the American system. And I'm going to go into the specifics of the latter as I know them. So what I am going to talk about, I hope, will be broadly helpful for anyone thinking of, postgraduate study or of applying for academic jobs in America. And the first thing I'll say is a little, I'm going to make a little note about the vocabulary, because postgraduate study is called graduate study in America. And I'm going to toggle between those phrases as I go, just to make sure everybody is not getting confused. The word professor as well is also used much more loosely. In the US system, anyone who teaches class can be referred to casually, informally, as a professor, although of course it's also an official title of somebody who's reached that rank in a way that's mostly comparable to the UK and Irish system. So a further point, I think, of potential confusion that I may cause with my vocabulary is that the term school and teaching are often used for third level and for lecturing at third level in the US, especially in conversation. So apologies if I cause any confusion. I'll try to remember all of that. So my journey across the Atlantic was as follows. And I should clarify that I never had some grand plan or grand strategy to end up teaching in American university. I was lucky enough, this was the start of it, to receive a postdoctoral fellowship, an NEH fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities, which is US government funding. I received this in Irish Studies at the Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. So this was a great postdoctoral opportunity. It occurred right as I finished up my PhD at Queen's University Belfast. So I didn't, of course, then study at undergraduate or postgraduate level in the US. So I won't claim that what I say here is comprehensive. So I guess this is just a caveat to use what I say here as a beginning point for your own research if you're thinking of studying or working in academia in the US. So Notre Dame, it's a highly ranked private university with a strong Catholic culture. It was while I was at the University of Notre Dame for the academic year that I began to seriously consider applying for jobs in the US. I found that there was much more open and sustained discussion of the need for gender and racial equality in university hiring in the US than in the systems I'd come from at the time. So as a woman, I felt that I might have more opportunities there. So I sat down and I read books on the academic job market. So there's lots of websites and so on, but there's also, thick volumes available that will sort of guide you in this process, because it's a complicated process. So that was both for, I read about the academic job market and applying for academic jobs. And as I said, there's whole books on that. Notre Dame also had a careers office for PhD students, so I was able to get help from them also, for which I'm grateful. But again, what they did in that office, that information is also available, in detail in books and on websites. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it takes a certain amount of preparation and research to delve into the university sector in the US. And this is very important. The lead-in time for application is much, much longer, both for study and for job application. So start prepping early, start thinking about it early, start researching early if you have any intention of crossing the Atlantic. So I applied for about 10 to 15 positions while at Notre Dame, and a handful of those mentioned Irish literature in some way. At the time, most academic jobs in English were advertised in the MLA job list, which comes out late in the year in America, and job interviews occurred at the January MLA convention, usually. So this is less true nowadays. That's still true, but the MLA still matters, but it isn't the absolute dominating force that it once was in terms of that job season, I suppose. So one of the job adverts I responded to that was very explicit about it being an Irish studies position in an English department was the University of Connecticut, which is in the very small rural town of Storrs, Connecticut. So I was very lucky to get that one. So though it's rural, the location is about halfway between New York and Boston, which is not as isolated as some campuses can be in the very vast US. So I'm able to teach a wide variety of courses at UConn. I teach undergraduate introductory courses, as well as postgraduate seminars in my research area. So UConn is a state-funded university, and by state, I mean Connecticut, not the US federal government. So it's an enormous institution. It's called, a flagship university of the state. So UConn is classified as a Research 1 university. Research 1s are committed to graduate education, postgraduate education through the doctorate. So they give high priority to research. They award 50 or more doctoral degrees each year, and Research 1s receive annually 40 million or more in federal support. Of course, much of that does not go to humanities. So there are 146 institutions classified as Research 1 in the US. So this is the designation you should look for when you're, when you're thinking about applying for a postgraduate study in the US, as postgraduate supervision and seminars delivered by research active scholars. These will be a super strong focus in such places. So that's where you need to land. Excuse me, I'll just take a little sip of water. So just to give you a sense, I've told you a bit about UConn, but US universities or colleges can be very small too. They can be located in even more isolated places, or they can, of course, be very large like UConn is. They can be state-funded like UConn is, or they can be private institutions that almost always cost much more to attend at undergraduate level, which I suppose is needless to say. Undergraduate programs in the US run for 4 years. MAs tend to be 2-year programs, and PhD programs run for 6 to 7 years. Undergraduate students in the US, they generally major in a particular discipline while receiving exposure to a wide range of academic subjects over 4 years. So in the US classroom, you may end up teaching literature or history, if you're a historian, to many students who are going on to major in a completely different subject. And I actually find that very rewarding. So a huge contrast between the Irish UK system and the US is that the latter, the US system, is much more diverse. Obviously, the US is large and it's more racially diverse. But what I mean is that there is also diversity of geography, of climate, of population, of culture, of denomination. And that variety is matched by the massive choice of third level institution in terms of focus, size, academic standards, or whether they are secular or have a specific religious ethos. All of those multiple factors can strongly shape a student's experience of college. Institutions with a religious ethos are private because of the formal divide between church and state that's baked into US culture and law. So not all third level institutions offer graduate study or may offer MAs but not PhDs. Some concentrate on undergraduate teaching and the undergraduate experience. And I'm referring here particularly to liberal arts colleges, which are a very American institution. They emphasize undergraduate study in liberal arts and general sciences. They tend to be small and can often be in isolated locations. So the experience for students may be, if it's maybe more akin to a private boarding school in Ireland or the UK, more akin to that than to the large campuses in urban or large town locations. That is the norm in Ireland and the UK. So a big difference between the UK and Irish and the American systems for the graduate, that is the postgraduate student, is that there is much more coaching and mentoring in the US, I'm sorry to say. So students tend to have 6 to 7 years of funding for a PhD, and it's typical to have an MA before applying to the PhD, at least in English departments. As I said, I'm speaking from my own experience. So graduate students take seminars in a series of subject topics with an eye to a probable dissertation, which isn't written until the latter half of the program. So a student will not necessarily have an exact dissertation topic when they enter the PhD track, or the dissertation topic may change as they take different seminars with a variety of professors. So the postgraduate student chooses their own dissertation topic. They will have a committee of, on average, 3 faculty members with different expertise who will all help them think through the multifaceted nature of their topic. So at UConn, at least, and I think in many other Research One universities, students will meet with that committee to discuss each chapter of the dissertation. So it can be a very long and very rigorous process. The committee is comprised of a major advisor and 2 associate advisors. And that vocabulary I've just used, that's used at UConn. It's not universal. Some other institutions use slightly different phrases. So depending on the relationship the student has with their committee members, they may well work intensely with all 3, particularly if they're pulling together 3 quite separate fields with a dissertation topic. And I just want to give you an example of what I mean by that. I've just finished working this week with a PhD student, she's just defended, whose dissertation required a scholar of film, a scholar of queer studies, and a scholar of Irish studies. So that student, she was writing on adaptations to the screen of queer Irish authors or authors with an Irish connection. So she really did need to draw on the expertise of all 3 of us quite intensely. So another plus is that at research universities, there can be a very big apparatus for helping postgraduate students to professionalize. And this is, of course, with an eye to the academic or the academic adjacent job market. And what I mean by that is students are increasingly looking beyond academia to, say, private high schools and so on, because of the dearth of jobs. So at UConn, graduate students are given the opportunity to teach introductory or writing skills classes to very junior undergraduates. And they're also given the opportunity to teach upper level classes that are relevant to their dissertation topic when they are farther into the PhD program. So I think this kind of breadth of teaching is not available in every PhD program, but I think at UConn it has allowed our graduates to be quite successful in a tight job market, as jobs in smaller campuses often require a breadth of expertise in professors so that they can cover diverse course offerings. So in a very small campus, you might be asked to teach Shakespeare and 20th century Irish poetry. And if you can somehow, because of your dissertation topic, teach both of those things, that will be very welcome and will make you, a pretty good commodity on the job market. So I think I'm going to finish on a happy note. So the PhD student I just referred to, who defended this week, she's moving to a job in a university in Indiana later this summer. So things do work out.
That's brilliant. It's very interesting to hear, because actually I know quite a few Notre Dame students. I did a summer program a couple of years ago, which
you did the
Patrick
institute.
Griffin.
Yeah, wonderful.
It included Patrick Griffin as well. He became a bit of a legend in our group as well. And it is, because in UK, as a PhD student, I was teaching, but it was very rigorous. It was a course designed by someone else, and the materials decided by someone else. There's very little freedom. There was freedom in the terms of how you're going to teach it, what kind of perspective do you take, which I really made an emphasis of doing myself. When we were talking about the Renaissance literature, for example, I made a link to Harlem Renaissance, which I thought was quite cool in many ways. And that went down really well because I had a Renaissance specialist who was eavesdropping without me knowing, and he actually really liked it. So yeah.
I should clarify that when students are first teaching, they're given, as I said, the sort of the classes where they're teaching writing skills or basic introductory classes. They don't have much control over that syllabus, right? That might be handed to them. It's later on when they are, more senior as PhD students, and they're their topic of their dissertation has come into focus, that they get given very relevant. So for instance, my student that I talked of there, she was given one of the classes. I tend to teach an upper level undergraduate class. She wrote the syllabus herself. She, of course, assigned some of the books from her dissertation to make life easier for herself, you know, and she did a fantastic job. So that, of course, that freedom comes later as well.
I know, but it's still, you get that experience of creating a class rather than just kind of verbalizing someone else's plans. So I think that's an important part of learning.
Yeah, it definitely helps in the job market, because I'll sometimes get a phone call from a department head for a graduate student for whom I've written a letter, and they're seriously considering them. They're down to the final 3 and so on. And they always ask me about their teaching. They never talk about the research. Yeah, it's pretty shocking, actually.
Yeah. It's interesting because coming from Finland as well, because in Finland it's very research heavy when you do a PhD. You're paid to do that because that's your job, is to do a PhD. Whereas here we get to pay for the privilege of doing a PhD. So it's interesting to have these conversations of different parts of the world who have different experiences. And I thought it was really good point that you made is prep early, because the length of time needed is so different than here. Here's relatively short. You can apply in July and you get accepted in August for the starting September. You know, that's something I did a couple of years ago when I decided to go back to school. I did that. I handed in my proposal or my application in late June. In July, they informed me they wanted me to do a language test for English, which I refused to do. And I had enough backup, luckily, that they eventually gave that up. And then I was accepted in August and I started in mid-September. So it's all very quick.
So it's very different in the US. So just to give an example, again, UConn is UConn, and other places will diverge slightly, but this will be an approximate timetable. So applications for, say, the graduate program, postgraduate program come in the very end of the year, towards the end of the year. Faculty read some of those applications over Christmas break, unfortunately. But, you know, it is what it is. And so by January, right before semester starts up again, after the winter break, it's called the winter break here. Again, everything is officially very secular in America. By the time winter break is over, the graduate program starts extending offers. And, you know, they toggle, they will extend offers to people who are being courted by multiple institutions. So sometimes they get a no, which means that right into, I think it can go quite late into spring, you may get an offer, you know, and again, you'll be starting. So that's, you know, you may get an offer very early in the year, or you may get an offer late in the spring for starting in the fall semester, which can be pretty much September. But it's very onerous in the US because you may have to cross the continent, you know. So
you need more time as well. Is everything's further away? But that's great. Thank you so much for that bit as well. It's always important for us to get that kind of postgraduate ECR perspectives as well. But I would like to ask a few questions on your actual book and research. One of them that I was thinking now while you were talking is about the different variegations and the denominations of it. And what I was reminded of, because you mentioned Frederick Douglass, he actually writes about his conflict with the Irish in his biography, in his narrative, because he worked at the docks at a while, and because how the Irish were treated in the US at the time and how Black Americans were treated in the US at the time. So he talked about that interesting kind of hierarchical system and oppression conflict between the two of at the time the most oppressed races in the US. So I wondered if you have any thoughts about that, like the 19th and the 20th century, because you talk about 20th century mostly, exclusively here in your book, about this kind of racialization. Was there any kind of, because you also talk about the kind of, about the kind of victimization within the kind of Irish racial structure as well. If you could elaborate on that or explore that.
So I do actually, in the book, I cover more than the 20th century. I do start with Edgar Huntley. I think that might be one of the earliest. And I do cover some 18th and 19th century texts, but mainly, as you say, it is the 20th century. But I'm always interested in how those 20th century authors are thinking about that past as well and representing it and evading it in some ways. So Douglas, in many ways, I suppose, that if I had to reduce my argument, to sort of a phrase, it would be that the Irish were both victims of and colluders in the racial structure of America. And that's not an original thought. Frederick Douglass said that back in the day. He was terrifically intrigued by, the anomalous, for him, the anomaly of an abject white population in Ireland, what that tells us about race as a fiction, what that tells us about settler colonialism. And then for him, the very sad fact that rather than making the Irish innately sympathetic to oppressed peoples of color in America, as it might have, as he wished it would have, as O'Connell promised him it would do, his friend O'Connell, instead the Irish threw their lot in with whiteness as quickly as they caught the opportunity. And Ignatieff, of course, whom I quote a lot in the book, the labor historian, has argued, he argues that the Irish whiten by oppressing African Americans effectively. They claim whiteness by denigrating the people with whom they competed in the job market. I'm talking about the impoverished post-1845 famine immigrants in America.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting how you mentioned that, because I've done a lot of research on Douglas in my master's degree, so it was very interesting to kind of hear that connection come up again, because I remember that passage, him talking about it specifically.
Yeah. Just a little note, I've taught at undergraduate level, I've done some upper level Irish American courses, and we did Colin McCann's novel Transatlantic, which has 3 portions. One of the portions depicts Douglas in Dublin. So my students, they find it a little problematic, but they also find it fascinating. But it certainly invokes lots of, it provokes lots of discussion. So it's an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, definitely. And you did, my next point was, and you did talk about this, the Gothic kind of links and thoughts quite extensively there, which was great. But why Gothic? Like more specifically, why that choice?
I think I take my cue to a certain extent from the historians who represent the Irish experience, particularly the Scots-Irish experience. More than one major historian sees Scots-Irish history as a kind of a repetition of a sort of a cycle of violence. And I was really struck by that historiography is borrowing vocabulary from literature. I also, as I said in the talk, I think we're always supposed to see Irish America represented in social realism and in memoir. And I don't think that gives us an inner history. That gives us an exterior history of certain, places and spaces at certain times and the overt signifiers of Irishness. But where do we go for the anxiety? Where do we go for the things that are slightly unspeakable? The traumatic history, the traumatic memory, the fact that that memory seems to repeat. So if history is unfinished in colonial Ireland, people walk away from Ireland because it's troubled, because they're troubled, because they've been involved in strife, either as victims or perpetrators. They walk away from that, but they bring that history with them to America. It doesn't go away. As you see with Jackson, the real life figure, but as you see, say, with Gerald O'Hara, Margaret Mitchell's figure. And I cite very briefly a wonderful ballad called Stumpy's Bray in the book, which is about a settler colonial couple in Ulster who murder a traveling man randomly, and they chop off his limbs and they try to bury him in his own rucksack. He's a traveling peddler. And then they flee to America. And they're fleeing to the wilds of America. So the implication is that this is the 18th century, that they're one of the early waves of the the Ulster Irish in the 18th century. But the very first sound they hear on the ship is the tapping of the stumps of the ghost who follows them to America. And one of the lines in the poem is something to the effect of, and he followed them to their dying day, and he follows their kin yet. You know, so that sense of they do the violence, they try to escape, the violence follows them literally onto the deck of the ship and haunts them and their descendants. So there's a wonderful speaking to anxiety in that ballad that I also find in Irish writers of varying, backgrounds in America. I think they really grapple with that sense of the motherland. They all were pretty knowledgeable about Ireland, even if they were uneasy with that knowledge. Henry James was very uneasy about his Irishness, in contrast to some of his siblings. His sister called herself an Irish nationalist, so it was kind of an uneven sort of identity within that family. But he was very uneasy around it, as Colin Tobin very beautifully represents, I think, in the novel The Master. And Fitzgerald as well didn't know what to do with his famine era, what he perceived to be his famine era ancestry. Actually, one of the things I had great fun with in the book was finding out that his Irish ancestry is much earlier in America than he ever discussed. It actually goes back into the 18th century, but he didn't know what to do with that because it didn't fit the idea of Irishness that had evolved in America after the famine.
That reminded me of another Gothicness is the Edgar Allan Poe thumping heart with the limbs. Yes. That immediately came to my head. So that I can really see that Gothic connection there.
Again, really briefly in a footnote, because I was trying to keep this book concise, so I ended up shoving things into footnotes that I really would like to have done more with. But one of his short stories, and I can't remember off the top of my head, one of his really sort of scary short stories seems to draw from the ballad I just mentioned. That may be a coincidence. It may speak to the shared cultural origins, because Poe, of course, is of deep Ulster ancestry as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And then more immediately, the slave trading, even in his I suppose his foster father's family. So there was all kinds of troubled pasts that he had to process, I think, in his work.
And that's another link then again with the Irish, the troubled past that they bring with them to the US and all of those.
Yeah, they tend to just obviously there are exceptions. I've tried to make this a very a very balanced history, because I think too many histories either try to defend the Irish or try to condemn them, and I think you can do both. And sort of it's a complicated story. It depends on time and location and so on. But in general, yes, the Irish tended to, if they saw themselves as victims, they did not see peoples of color as victims when they in turn became agents of oppression in the Americas. And I think that's one of the great kind of tragedies of Irish American history in some ways,
Yeah, that leads me to as a literary studies student, a multidisciplinary student, that leads me to the next question, which I think comes across in your book as well and in your research. Is there an argument to be taken from your book and your research that in some ways there is a reason to, and you're aiming to as well, to correct the notion that there's the white Irish Catholic male voice is the most prevalent and it's representing Irish? The only correct way to do that is the white Catholic, the Kennedys, basically, you know, and how that comes across, because you do mention that there are the female and the queer voices and all of those Irish
multiracial voices.
Yeah, I could elaborate that would be great.
Yeah, there have been great surveys of Irish American fiction that I draw on, but they tend to foreground, the white Catholic post-famine. So I was really interested in, so I cover somebody called Ellen Glasgow, who's a major regional writer, who does somewhat similar things to Margaret Mitchell. She's a Scots-Irish Presbyterian, very aware of that voice. Explicitly says in one of her works, the Scots-Irish voice is inaudible in America, which is so interesting. I really ran with that. I thought that was fabulous. So somebody like Ellen Glasgow, somebody like Margaret Mitchell, who I think even when we, pay attention to sort of Catholic Irish American women writers, but also I think as well, I tried to trouble the notion that all Catholics were you know, poor and so on. Margaret Mitchell was of gentry origin, you know, so there's certain values. One of her biographers said that when her maternal ancestors, they were Fitzgeralds, funnily enough, left Tipperary and arrived in some convoluted way in the south to take over the plantation, he said they fell right in with the planter order because of their background. So I was interested in those kind of class differences as well. The coiner of the term manifest destiny, which of course is used to justify the notion of white expansion across the continent in America, was actually, again, Irish Catholic gentry ancestry. Out of he had a Jacobite peerage, so class is in there. Obviously, I wanted to include women writers. Somebody like Frankie Yerby, the writer I have a slide about. He was of African American and Scots-Irish ancestry. So his answer to his writing back to Mitchell is terrifically interesting because he foregrounds as the narrative goes on. He increasingly foregrounds the Black and mixed race characters, and everybody's kind of mixed race to begin with, including his Irish planter, who is, you know, racially ambiguous because of his poor Irish origins, and eventually becomes quite guilty for being a planter because of that origin. But he's also Yerby's also really interested in how poor whites are excluded in the slave economy, you know, because he would have, you know, identified a huge portion of, or a huge cohort within the poor white community. A rural poor white community would have been you know, deep Irish ancestry, particularly Scots-Irish ancestry. So his own background primed him to have a very, I think, three-dimensional vision of exactly how the slave system dispossessed both poor whites and, of course, enslaved Blacks as well, which was way ahead of its time. And don't forget, he's a popular writer, and he's presenting in a very subtle way this really theoretically sophisticated vision of sort of the impact, the tendrils of sort of the slave system, how it reaches all kinds of sectors of society. The only people it benefits are landed white people. Everybody else is excluded. And I think that was that hybrid background he had that sort of made him very aware of how it functioned, you know.
Yeah, and that beautiful ties to our last talk we had with Dr. Corey Garibaldi.
Yes.
We talked about Frank Yerby as well.
I mentioned to you that I quote Corey in my book. He's one of the great finds that I was like, thank goodness somebody's written about Yerby as Irish American. This is so great.
It's interesting how these things link up as well. Research being done, you know, in different parts in different ways, but including the same individuals as well. So it is quite an interesting to see that scholarly connections as well.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I'll say, you know, to go back to sort of the talk on those thinking of crossing the Atlantic, is that America is big, but within your own discipline, your own field, it gets smaller and smaller. So, you know, especially if you I go to the Irish Studies conferences on both sides of the Atlantic. So you do end up seeing exciting work being done and become aware of it, and that's great. So, you know, if you're very research active and conference active, that conversation seems intimate, actually, despite the vast distances.
Oh yeah, and there's the great Irish American Association here in Ireland as well that are very active, as well as there's the Frederick Douglass Week that happens every year. So there's a lot of this kind of Irish American connection happening both sides of the Atlantic as well, which is, you know, very living.
Yeah, it's really, I think since Obama, there's an increasing awareness of you know, mixed race Irishness. It's increasingly part of the conversation, you know.
Yeah. Great. I am very conscious of the time. We are just over an hour at the moment, which is great. So thank you so much, Mary. It's been a delight. And for everyone else, we will make this available within the next week on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much.
Okay. It's been my pleasure. Lovely to meet you, Aya. Thank you, everybody.